The candles flickered in the grand chamber as Lady Evelyn Lancaster stood before the mirror, her trembling fingers adjusting the ivory silk of her wedding gown. Tonight, she would marry a man she'd met only twice, a decorated war hero known throughout England as the Iron Duke, but beneath the delicate fabric that adorned her body lay secrets etched into her skin, stories of survival she prayed he would never discover. In the next room, Alexander Grayson, Duke of Ashford, poured himself a third glass of brandy, steeling himself for a marriage he viewed as nothing more than a strategic alliance. Both believed they understood the terms of their arrangement. Neither could have imagined how one glimpse of hidden scars would shatter every carefully constructed wall between them, transforming a marriage of convenience into something far more dangerous and infinitely more real. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're hearing this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. The Lancaster estate had seen better days. Once a jewel of Gloucestershire, with manicured gardens stretching toward rolling hills and ballrooms that hosted the finest of English society, the manor now bore the subtle marks of genteel decay. Paint flaked from window frames, and the east wing remained closed to conserve heating costs. Yet from the road, with its limestone facade catching the morning sun, Thornfield Manor still projected an illusion of prosperity, an illusion Lady Evelyn Lancaster had become expert at maintaining. At 22 years old, Evelyn moved through the morning room with practiced grace, her dark auburn hair arranged in fashionable ringlets, her posture impeccable despite the corset that made breathing a calculated effort. She wore a day dress of pale blue muslin that had been altered 3 times to keep pace with changing styles, though no one would guess it. Her fingers, long and elegant, traced the rim of her teacup as she listened to her father outline the terms of her salvation. "The Duke of Ashford has agreed to the match," Lord Henry Lancaster announced, his voice carrying the forced brightness of a man reprieved from debtor's prison. "The settlements are generous. More than generous. Your mother's medical expenses will be covered, the estate's debts cleared, and a substantial income settled upon you." Evelyn's younger sister Charlotte sat across the table, her pretty face alight with barely concealed excitement. At 19, Charlotte possessed their mother's golden curls and an enviable talent for attracting admiration without effort. "A duke, Evelyn! Can you imagine? You'll be a duchess. You'll outrank everyone in the county." "Everyone except the royal family," Evelyn replied softly, setting down her cup with measured care. The china was Sèvres, one of the few valuable pieces they hadn't yet been forced to sell. Her father cleared his throat. "The Duke is, by all accounts, a man of impeccable character, decorated for his service in the Peninsular War, connections at the highest levels of government, estates in 3 counties. His late father left the dukedom in excellent order." What her father didn't say, but what Evelyn had learned through careful attention to gossip and the scandal sheets, was that Alexander Grayson had returned from war 3 years prior, fundamentally changed. The charming young lord who had left for Spain had come back cold, methodical, and emotionally impenetrable. He rarely attended social functions, managed his estates with ruthless efficiency, and had rejected every matrimonial prospect until now. Evelyn understood why he had finally acquiesced to marriage. He was 31, the last of his line, and pressure from Parliament and his family's remaining relations had finally overcome his resistance. She understood equally well why he had chosen her. The Lancaster name carried weight. Despite their financial troubles, she had managed the household since her mother's illness began 5 years ago, and most critically, she had no fortune of her own to invite scheming relatives or raise questions about his motives. They had met twice. Once at a formal dinner at the home of mutual acquaintances, where he had been distantly polite, asking cursory questions about her interests and accomplishments. The second time, he had come to Thornfield to discuss the marriage settlements with her father, while she served tea with trembling hands, acutely aware of his dark eyes, assessing her like a steward evaluating livestock. He was undeniably handsome in the severe way of classical sculpture. Strong jaw, dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, tall frame that spoke of both his aristocratic breeding and his military background. But there was no warmth in his face, no light in his eyes. When he looked at her, she felt as though he was seeing through her to some calculation only he understood. "The wedding is set for 3 weeks hence," her father continued, "at St. George's, Hanover Square. The Duke has agreed to a modest ceremony, 200 guests. The breakfast will be held at Ashford House in Mayfair. 200 guests qualified as modest only in the rarefied world of the aristocracy." Evelyn's hands felt cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Charlotte leaned forward conspiratorially. "They say Ashford House has 40 bedrooms. 40! And the Duke's principal seat in Derbyshire is practically a palace. You'll want for nothing, Evelyn." Evelyn met her sister's excited gaze and managed a smile. Charlotte meant well. She couldn't understand that Evelyn would trade every bedroom and every acre for the freedom to choose her own path, to perhaps marry someone who might see her as more than a solution to inconvenient problems. But such romantic notions were luxuries the Lancaster family could no longer afford. Her mother's illness required expensive treatments and constant care. Her father's investments had failed spectacularly, and the estate generated barely enough income to maintain appearances. Without this marriage, they would lose Thornfield within the year. Her mother would die in a charity hospital, and Charlotte's prospects would evaporate entirely. Evelyn had made her peace with duty long ago. On the night her mother had collapsed during what should have been Evelyn's debut season, crying out in pain from the mysterious ailment that would plague her for years, Evelyn had set aside her schoolgirl dreams. She had learned to manage the household accounts, to negotiate with increasingly impatient creditors, to stretch resources until they nearly snapped. She had learned to present a serene face to society while calculating in her mind exactly how many weeks remained before crisis. What her family didn't know, what no one could ever know, was the price she had already paid for their survival. The memories that haunted her sleep. The scars hidden beneath layers of silk and muslin that told a story she would take to her grave. 2 years earlier, when the debts had become truly insurmountable, her father had arranged for her to companion Lady Ashworth, a wealthy widow known for her charitable works. The position had seemed a godsend. Generous compensation, respectable duties, a chance to make connections that might improve their situation. But Lady Ashworth's nephew, Marcus Ashworth, had seen Evelyn's circumstances and understood exactly how vulnerable she was. The assault had happened during a house party at the Ashworth country estate. Evelyn had been checking the arrangements for the following day's garden party when Marcus had cornered her in the conservatory, his breath thick with brandy, his intentions brutally clear. She had fought him. God, how she had fought. But he was stronger, and her screams were muffled by the sound of music from the ballroom beyond. She had escaped before the worst could happen, but not before his rage at her resistance had found expression through a shard of glass from a shattered pot. The cuts on her shoulder and side had been deep, requiring desperate and secret treatment from a sympathetic housemaid who had suffered similar abuse. Evelyn had invented a story about a fall on broken glass, sworn the maid to secrecy with money she couldn't spare, and returned to Thornfield 3 days later, her injuries hidden beneath high-necked gowns. She had never told anyone. Marcus Ashworth was protected by wealth, gender, and social position. Who would believe a desperate girl from an impoverished family over the nephew of one of society's most respected matrons? The accusation would have destroyed what remained of her reputation and eliminated any chance of the advantageous marriage her family desperately needed. So she had buried the trauma, locked it away behind the same serene mask she wore when reviewing the household accounts or managing the servants. She had learned to breathe through the panic that seized her when men stood too close, to suppress the flinch when unexpected sounds pierced the quiet. She had become expert at hiding wounds no one could see. Now, Sitting in the morning room as her father detailed the glory of her upcoming marriage, Evelyn felt the familiar weight of secrets pressing against her ribs. In 3 weeks, she would marry Alexander Grayson. She would become the Duchess of Ashford, mistress of multiple estates, a woman of wealth and position. And on their wedding night, she would have to find a way to hide the scars that mapped her trauma across her skin, to perform the duties expected of a wife while praying he wouldn't notice, wouldn't question, wouldn't demand explanations she could never provide. "Evelyn?" Her father's voice cut through her reverie. "Did you hear me?" She blinked, refocusing on his face. "Forgive me. My mind wandered. I said the Duke wishes to call on you tomorrow. He suggests a walk in the gardens, weather permitting. He believes you should become better acquainted before the wedding." Better acquainted, as though 3 weeks of stilted conversation could transform strangers into partners, as though understanding could be manufactured on schedule like any other contract term. "Of course," Evelyn replied. "I shall look forward to it." The lie came easily. She had become fluent in the language of acceptable falsehoods, the pretty phrases that greased the wheels of social interaction. She would walk with the Duke, discuss the weather and her accomplishments, allow him to believe he was marrying a compliant, decorative wife who would manage his households and produce his heirs without complication. And if her hands shook when she undressed at night, if nightmares regularly shattered her sleep, if the thought of surrendering her body to masculine possession made her want to flee into the night, well, those were simply the prices paid by women in her position. Duty demanded sacrifice. Love was a luxury for heroines in novels, not for real women with real responsibilities. As Charlotte continued to chatter excitedly about wedding plans and the items Evelyn would need for her trousseau, Evelyn gazed out the window at the November landscape. Bare trees clawed at grey skies, and the gardens that had once been her mother's pride now showed signs of neglect that no amount of creative pruning could disguise. In 3 weeks, she would leave this failing estate for a marriage that promised security, but nothing resembling happiness. She would bind herself to a cold, distant man who saw her as a means to an end, and she would carry her secrets like stones sewn into her pockets, weighing her down but never dragging her fully under. Because Lancaster women were survivors. They endured, they adapted, they did what necessity demanded, even when it cost them everything they had once dreamed of becoming. The wedding day arrived with unseasonable clarity, the November sun breaking through London's perpetual haze to cast golden light across the Portland stone facade of St. George's Church. Inside the hallowed space, 200 members of the aristocracy filled the pews, their jewels and fine clothing creating a kaleidoscope of wealth and privilege. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse flowers. White roses, lilies and orchids arranged in towering displays that must have cost a small fortune. Evelyn stood in the vestibule, her father's arm trembling slightly beneath her gloved hand. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory, silk and Belgian lace, the product of London's finest modiste and the Duke's seemingly unlimited funds. The high neckline and long sleeves had been her only specifications, requirements she had framed as modesty, but which served a more desperate purpose. Beneath the expensive fabric, her scars remained hidden, protected by layers of silk chemise and carefully positioned undergarments. "You look beautiful, my dear," her father whispered, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your mother would be so proud." Her mother, too ill to attend, remained at Thornfield under the care of a new physician whose services were now secured by the Duke's money. Charlotte stood just ahead as maid of honor, radiant in her gown of pale pink silk, a smile of genuine happiness lighting her face. The organ's first notes swelled through the sanctuary, and Evelyn's feet moved forward automatically, carrying her toward an altar where Alexander Grayson, Duke of Ashford, stood waiting with the rigid posture of a military officer at inspection. He wore formal dress with austere perfection, black coat, silver waistcoat, cravat tied in a style that suggested either a valet's expertise or his own exacting standards. As she progressed down the aisle, Evelyn was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes tracking her movement, assessing her worthiness to join such an elevated rank. She recognized faces from her limited exposure to society: Lady Jersey, whose approval could make or break a reputation; Lord Castlereagh, powerful in government circles; the Duchess of Bedford, a distant connection of the Grayson family. They were all here to witness the Iron Duke finally succumb to matrimonial duty. When she reached the altar, Alexander turned to face her. His expression was controlled, revealing nothing of his thoughts as he looked at her for the first time in the formal context of their union. His dark eyes, the color of bitter chocolate, met hers briefly before sliding away to focus on the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was to perform the ceremony. The service proceeded with ritualistic precision. Evelyn responded to her vows in a clear voice that betrayed none of her inner turmoil, promising to love, honor, and obey a man she barely knew, binding herself legally and spiritually to his will. When Alexander spoke his corresponding vows, his voice was deep and steady, devoid of emotion, a man fulfilling an obligation with the same efficiency he likely brought to estate management and parliamentary votes. The moment came for him to place the ring on her finger, a band of gold set with diamonds that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. His hands were steady as he slid it onto her fourth finger, the metal cool against her skin. They knelt for the blessing, rose for the pronouncement, and then it was done. She was no longer Evelyn Lancaster, but Evelyn Grayson, Duchess of Ashford, bound to this man until death released her. The wedding breakfast at Ashford House should have been the triumphant celebration her family so desperately needed. The Mayfair mansion was everything Charlotte had promised and more, a testament to generations of accumulated wealth and taste. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and gilt moulding. The tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes prepared by French chefs, and champagne flowed with aristocratic abandon. Evelyn sat at the head table beside her new husband, accepting congratulations with gracious words while her corset felt increasingly constricting. Alexander maintained his distance even in proximity, addressing her with formal courtesy, but no warmth. His attention frequently drawn to conversations with male guests about politics and agricultural improvements. It was during the toasts that the first crack appeared in the carefully constructed facade of the day. Lord Pembroke, one of Alexander's fellow officers from the Peninsular War, rose unsteadily with his champagne glass, his face flushed with drink. "To the Duke," he began, his words slightly slurred, "who swore he would never surrender to the matrimonial state, yet here we find him properly leg-shackled at last." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. "Though I suppose when one's options are limited to impoverished gentry, desperate enough to overlook his frozen demeanor, even the Iron Duke must eventually yield to necessity." The room fell into shocked silence. Evelyn felt heat flood her face, humiliation burning through her chest. Beside her, Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he made no move to defend her or respond to the crude observation. It was Charlotte who broke the terrible quiet, her voice carrying across the ballroom with bright artificial cheer. "At least Evelyn has secured a title and fortune. Some of us must rely on more natural attractions." Her emphasis on the final words dripped with condescension, and her smile toward Evelyn contained something sharp that Evelyn had never seen before in her sister's face. Lady Jersey, never one to miss an opportunity for devastating commentary, added in a stage whisper clearly intended to be overheard, "One must admire the Lancaster family's pragmatism to secure such an advantageous match despite their circumstances. Shows remarkable strategic thinking, though I wonder what the Duke expects in return for his charity." Evelyn's fingers gripped her napkin beneath the table, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. The message was clear. Society saw her marriage exactly as Lord Pembroke had articulated it. She was a desperate woman from a failing family who had trapped an unwilling duke through his sense of duty and his need for an heir. She brought nothing to the match except her aristocratic bloodline and her desperation. What made it worse was Alexander's continued silence. He sat beside her like a carved statue, offering no defense, no contradiction to the characterization of their marriage as a cold transaction. His lack of response was an answer in itself, confirmation that the assessment was accurate, that he viewed her exactly as society did. The remainder of the breakfast passed in a blur of forced smiles and burning humiliation. Guests who had been effusive in their congratulations earlier now regarded her with a mixture of pity and disdain. She heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks exchanged between women who had never experienced financial desperation and couldn't imagine degrading themselves through such an mercenary union. When the time finally came to depart for Ashford Hall, the Duke's principal seat in Derbyshire where they would spend the first weeks of their marriage, Evelyn felt relief wash over her despite her dread of what awaited. Anything seemed preferable to remaining under the collective judgment of London society. The journey north took 2 days, travelling in a luxurious carriage that bore the Ashford crest and was sprung for maximum comfort. They stopped overnight at a posting inn where Alexander had secured separate rooms, sparing her the wedding night ordeal for at least one more day. He spent the evening in the public room below while she remained in her chamber, staring at the unfamiliar wallpaper and wondering how she would survive a lifetime of this cold arrangement. They arrived at Ashford Hall near dusk on the second day. The estate was magnificent even in the fading light, a Palladian masterpiece set in parkland designed by Capability Brown, with a lake reflecting the darkening sky and ancient oaks standing sentinel along the drive. Inside, the servants were lined up for inspection, a small army of people whose livelihoods now depended on her ability to manage the household with appropriate efficiency. Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, showed Evelyn to the Duchess's chambers, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and gold, with windows overlooking the gardens and a bed large enough to accommodate 4 people comfortably. The luxury would have taken her breath away if she had any breath left to lose after the day's revelations about her new position in society. "His Grace's chambers are through that door, Your Grace," Mrs. Crawford said, indicating a connecting door that loomed in Evelyn's peripheral vision like a threat. "He has asked me to inform you that he will join you at 9 o'clock. Dinner will be served in your sitting room at 7. Is there anything else you require?" Evelyn shook her head, not trusting her voice. When the housekeeper departed, she sank onto the edge of the enormous bed, her travelling dress suddenly feeling like armour that was both too heavy and entirely insufficient for the battle ahead. 9 o'clock. Less than 3 hours remained before Alexander would exercise his conjugal rights, before she would have to undress before him and reveal what she had worked so desperately to hide. The thought made her stomach clench with fear, that had nothing to do with typical bridal nerves and everything to do with the memories that haunted her dreams. A maid appeared to help her prepare, drawing a bath and laying out a nightgown of sheer silk and lace that left almost nothing to imagination. Evelyn stared at the garment with barely controlled panic. There was no possibility of wearing it. The scars would be immediately visible through the transparent fabric. "I'll wear my own nightdress," she said firmly, directing the maid to retrieve her personal belongings. From her trunk, she extracted a modest nightgown she had brought from Thornfield. High-necked, long-sleeved, made of thick cotton that revealed nothing. It was entirely inappropriate for a wedding night, but it was her only option. The maid's expression registered surprise, but she helped Evelyn into the garment without comment. When her hair was brushed and braided loosely over one shoulder, when the lamps were lit and the fire built up to ward off November's chill, the maid curtsied and withdrew, leaving Evelyn alone with her racing thoughts. She heard the clock in the sitting room chime 9 times. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The connecting door opened and Alexander Grayson entered her chamber. He had changed into a dressing gown of dark blue silk over evening clothes, his hair slightly dishevelled as though he had run his hands through it. He stopped just inside the doorway, his dark eyes sweeping over her figure in the unflattering nightgown, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with expectation and dread. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "I believe we should address the practical aspects of this marriage directly. I require an heir. You require security for your family. We need not pretend this is anything other than what it is, a business arrangement that serves both our purposes." Each word landed like a stone, confirming every humiliating observation made at the wedding breakfast. Evelyn stood frozen beside the bed, unable to respond. He continued, moving closer with measured steps. "I will be respectful of your person and your dignity. I expect the same courtesy in return. Our public interactions should reflect appropriate harmony. In private, I see no need for pretense beyond what is necessary to fulfill the basic requirements of the union." He had reached her now, standing close enough that she could smell the faint scent of brandy on his breath and the sandalwood soap he favored. His hand reached out toward the buttons at her throat, and Evelyn flinched involuntarily, a reaction she couldn't suppress. Alexander's hand froze mid-motion, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her face. "Are you frightened of me?" "No," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're trembling." His observation was clinical, absent of concern or curiosity beyond the factual. "I am inexperienced," she managed, which was true even if it wasn't the full explanation for her fear. Alexander's expression hardened, misinterpreting her response as typical bridal nerves. "I am not a brute. The process may be uncomfortable initially, but I will endeavor to be as quick as possible." His words, intended perhaps to be reassuring, only reinforced the transactional nature of what was about to occur. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to summon the resolve that had carried her through every other impossible situation. This was simply another duty, another sacrifice required by her circumstances. She could endure it, as she had endured everything else. His fingers returned to her buttons, working them free with efficient movements. When he pushed the fabric aside to expose her shoulder, his hand brushed against the ridges of scar tissue that no amount of preparation had successfully hidden. Alexander went completely still. His fingers traced the raised lines, following their path from her shoulder toward her collarbone with a feather-light touch that made her shudder. When he spoke, his voice had lost its controlled neutrality, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. "What is this?" Evelyn's eyes flew open to find him staring at the scars with an intensity that made her breath catch. His face had transformed, the careful blankness replaced by something fierce and almost frightening. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "An old injury. An accident. Don't lie to me." His command was absolute, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His hand moved to the other buttons, pushing the nightgown down to reveal more of the network of scars that crossed her shoulder and disappeared beneath the fabric at her side. "These are not accidents. These are defensive wounds. I've seen enough combat injuries to recognize the pattern." Panic seized Evelyn's throat. She tried to pull away, but his hand caught her wrist, not painfully, but with unmistakable firmness. "Who did this to you?" Each word was clipped, precise, vibrating with barely contained rage that seemed entirely disproportionate from a man who had demonstrated no previous capacity for strong emotion. "It doesn't matter," Evelyn whispered. Tears she had sworn never to shed burning behind her eyes. "It was 2 years ago. It's over. It matters." Alexander released her wrist and stepped back, running both hands through his hair in a gesture of profound agitation. "Christ, you married me while carrying this?" The way he said it, as though her scars were a burden she had deliberately hidden, a flaw that made the transaction unequal, broke something inside her. The humiliation of the day, the fear of the moment, the accumulated weight of 2 years of silence suddenly erupted in a flash of defiance. "Forgive me for not advertising my damages in the marriage negotiations," she said, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "Should I have included a clause in the settlement? Please note, bride damaged, discount accordingly." Alexander's face went white. then red, emotions flickering across his features too quickly to interpret. "That's not—" He stopped, jaw working as he visibly fought for control. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Give me a name." "What?" "The man who did this. Give me his name." Evelyn stared at him, bewildered by the transformation from cold indifference to volcanic fury. "Why?" "Because," Alexander said, each word dropping like ice into stillness, "I need to know who to kill." Alexander Grayson did not kill anyone that night, though the murderous intent that had blazed in his dark eyes suggested he was entirely capable of it. Instead, he had stood in the Duchess's chamber, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, visibly struggling with demons Evelyn couldn't name. After what felt like an eternity of charged silence, he had finally spoken in a voice scraped raw with effort. "I will sleep in my own chambers tonight. We will discuss this tomorrow when we are both calmer." He had departed through the connecting door without another word, leaving Evelyn standing alone in her wedding night finery, her secrets exposed, but her body inviolate. She had collapsed onto the bed in a confusion of relief and terror, unable to understand what had just transpired or what consequences would follow. Sleep had been impossible. She had lain awake through the long hours, listening to sounds from the adjoining room, footsteps pacing back and forth, the clink of glass against glass, suggesting substantial quantities of brandy being consumed, once what might have been his fist striking something solid. When dawn finally crept through the windows, she rose, feeling hollowed out, her emotions scraped clean, leaving only exhausted numbness. The next 2 weeks had passed in a strange limbo. Alexander maintained rigid formality in their interactions, addressing her as "Your Grace" with unfailing courtesy, consulting her on household matters, ensuring she had everything required to assume her role as Duchess. But he never again mentioned the scars or demanded the name she had refused to provide. He never entered her chamber after dark. He was a model of respectful distance, treating her like a valued colleague in the business of estate management rather than a wife. The servants, initially prepared for the typical honeymoon period of newly wedded nobility, adjusted to the reality of separate chambers and minimal physical interaction with the discretion born of long service. If they gossiped below stairs about the Duke's failure to consummate his marriage, they were too well trained to let any hint of it reach Evelyn's ears. It was Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, who finally breached the wall of Evelyn's isolation. The older woman had served the Grayson family for 30 years, had known Alexander since he was a boy, and possessed the kind of hard-earned wisdom that transcended class boundaries. "Your Grace," she said one morning as she reviewed the household accounts with Evelyn in the sitting room, "forgive my impertinence, but you seem troubled." Evelyn looked up from the ledgers, surprised by the observation. She had thought she was maintaining appropriate composure. "I'm adjusting to my new circumstances." Mrs. Crawford's shrewd eyes studied her face with uncomfortable perception. "His Grace is also troubled, more so than I've seen him since he returned from the war." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Whatever passes between a husband and wife is not my business. But I've known that boy since he was in leading strings, and I've never seen him so unsettled." "I don't understand what you mean." "The Duke came home from Spain, changed, Your Grace. He was always serious, always conscious of duty, but the war took something from him. Made him cold where he had been merely reserved, made him distant where he had been private." Mrs. Crawford set down her pen with deliberate care. "But these past weeks, watching him with you, he's not cold, he's careful. There's a difference." Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that observation. Alexander had shown her nothing but careful courtesy since their wedding night, maintaining exactly the kind of businesslike distance he had originally outlined. If that represented some departure from his usual demeanor, she had no basis for comparison. It was the arrival of Alexander's aunt that catalyzed the first real shift in their frozen dynamic. Lady Augusta Grayson descended upon Ashford Hall with the force of a benevolent hurricane, bringing with her 3 carriages full of luggage, her elderly pug, and an unwavering commitment to speaking her mind regardless of social convention. "So you're the girl who finally got my nephew to the altar," Lady Augusta announced upon her arrival, subjecting Evelyn to a thorough visual inspection. "Pretty enough, I suppose, though you look half-starved. Mrs. Crawford, why isn't this girl being fed properly?" "Aunt Augusta," Alexander said with the first hint of warmth Evelyn had heard in his voice since their wedding, "you were not expected until next month. I wasn't going to wait that long to meet my new niece. Good Lord, boy, you look terrible. When was the last time you slept?" Lady Augusta turned her sharp gaze back to Evelyn. "And you, child, why do you look like you're about to face a firing squad? This is supposed to be your honeymoon, not a funeral." Evelyn found herself fighting the inappropriate urge to laugh. Lady Augusta was perhaps 60, dressed in the height of fashion with an enormous turban adorning her grey hair, and possessed a kind of forthright manner that seemed to slice through pretense like a hot knife through butter. Over the following days, Lady Augusta established herself as a force of nature in the household. She insisted on taking tea with Evelyn every afternoon, asking probing questions about her background, her interests, and her observations of Ashford Hall. She also, to Evelyn's surprise, seemed to have a remarkable understanding of her nephew's character. "Alexander blames himself, you know," Lady Augusta said one afternoon as they sat in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants that bloomed despite winter's approach. "For things that happened during the war, things he couldn't control but felt responsible for nonetheless." Evelyn set down her teacup, uncertain how to navigate this conversation. "I don't understand. He was a captain in the peninsula. Good officer, from what I understand. His men respected him, trusted him with their lives. But war is chaos, child. Things go wrong, people die. And Alexander, with his overdeveloped sense of duty, couldn't forgive himself for the deaths he couldn't prevent." Lady Augusta's usually sharp voice softened slightly. "He came home believing that feeling nothing was safer than feeling too much. That distance was protection. I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because I've watched him these past days. The way he looks at you when you're not watching. The way his whole body tenses when you enter a room, like he's bracing for impact. The way he's been drinking himself to sleep every night." Lady Augusta leaned forward, her eyes suddenly piercing. "That's not indifference, my dear. That's a man trying desperately not to feel something he thinks will destroy him." The observation should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified Evelyn. She didn't want Alexander to feel anything for her beyond contractual obligation. Emotion complicated everything, created expectations she couldn't meet, demanded vulnerabilities she couldn't afford to reveal beyond what he had already glimpsed. "He saw your scars." It was not a question. Lady Augusta's perception was evidently as sharp as her tongue. Evelyn felt heat flood her face. "How? Mrs. Crawford is discreet, but she's also worried. She mentioned that His Grace appeared disturbed after your wedding night, that he's been sleeping in his chambers rather than yours, and that you both look like you're walking on broken glass around each other." Lady Augusta's expression softened into something almost maternal. "I've lived through 70 years of society's nonsense, child. I know what scars like that usually mean. I also know that shame belongs to the man who inflicted them, not to the woman who survived them." Tears sprang to Evelyn's eyes before she could prevent them. In 2 years, no one had spoken with such direct understanding of what she had endured. No one had named the shame she carried or suggested it was misplaced. Lady Augusta handed her a handkerchief embroidered with the Grayson crest. "Did you tell him who did it?" Evelyn shook her head. "He asked. I refused." "Why?" "Because it doesn't matter. Because nothing can change what happened. Because—" Her voice broke. "Because I married him under false pretenses. He thought he was getting an untainted bride, and instead—" "Stop!" Lady Augusta's command was absolute. "You are not tainted. You are not damaged goods. You are a woman who survived something terrible and had the strength to continue living." She paused, studying Evelyn's face. "My nephew asked who hurt you because he wants to protect you. That instinct, the one he's been suppressing for 3 years, is clawing its way back to life because of you. The question is whether you'll let him." Before Evelyn could formulate a response, the door to the conservatory opened and Alexander himself appeared, stopping short when he saw his aunt and wife in earnest conversation. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Aunt Augusta, I should have known I'd find you interrogating my wife. Someone needs to have honest conversations in this household," Lady Augusta replied tartly. "You're both too busy being excessively polite to each other to address anything meaningful." A muscle twitched in Alexander's jaw. "Perhaps we prefer privacy to spectacle. Privacy is one thing, cowardice is another." Lady Augusta rose, gathering her pug from where it had been napping in a patch of sunlight. "I'm going to rest before dinner. You two should actually talk to each other. Revolutionary concept, I know." And she swept from the room with the regal bearing of someone utterly unconcerned with causing discomfort, leaving Evelyn and Alexander alone for the first time since their wedding night. The silence stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Alexander moved to the windows, keeping his back to her as he stared out at the formal gardens. "My aunt has never been subtle. She means well," Evelyn replied softly. "She usually does." He turned to face her then, and Evelyn was struck by how tired he looked. Lady Augusta had been right. There were shadows under his eyes, tension in his shoulders that spoke of insufficient sleep and excessive worry. "Evelyn, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "I handled our wedding night poorly. I frightened you. That was never my intention." "You didn't frighten me," she said, which was not entirely true but seemed kinder than the alternative. "I saw your face. I saw you flinch." His hands clenched at his sides. "I swore when I came home from war that I would never again be the cause of fear in anyone's eyes. And on our first night together, I made my wife afraid of me." The rawness in his voice caught Evelyn off guard. This was not the cold, controlled duke of their prior interactions. This was something unguarded, almost broken. "I wasn't afraid of you," she said carefully. "I was afraid of what you might think of me, of how you might respond to—" She gestured vaguely at herself, unable to articulate the shame she still carried. Alexander's eyes darkened with something fierce. "I think you're remarkably brave. I think you survived something that would have destroyed a weaker person. I think whoever hurt you deserves to rot in hell, and I think it's taking every shred of self-control I possess not to hunt him down and deliver him there personally." The vehemence of his words sent shock through Evelyn's system. "Why do you care? Our marriage is a business arrangement. You said so yourself." "I was wrong." The admission seemed to cost him something. "I thought I could approach this marriage the way I approach estate management, with logic, planning, and emotional distance. But I was wrong." "I don't understand." Alexander crossed the space between them, stopping just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "When I saw your scars, when I understood what they meant, something in me, something I thought the war had killed, came roaring back to life. And I've spent 2 weeks trying to suppress it, trying to return to the safe, controlled distance I've maintained for years. But I can't." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to know you. The real you, not the carefully composed duchess you present to the household. I want to understand what brings you joy and what causes you pain. I want—" He stopped, jaw working as he fought for the right words. "I want this marriage to be something more than a business arrangement, if you'll allow it." The vulnerability in his face was almost painful to witness. This was not the Iron Duke of society gossip or the cold stranger from their wedding. This was a man offering something precious and terrifying, the possibility of genuine connection, of partnership that transcended contracts and duties. Evelyn felt the instinctive urge to protect herself, to retreat behind the walls she had so carefully constructed. But Lady Augusta's words echoed in her mind. That's not indifference. That's a man trying desperately not to feel something he thinks will destroy him. Maybe she wasn't the only one carrying wounds that needed healing. Maybe survival didn't have to mean remaining forever frozen in the moment of trauma. "I'd like that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "To know you too." Alexander's expression transformed, a smile breaking across his features that made him look years younger. "Then perhaps we should start again, properly this time." He took her hand, his touch gentle, waiting for any sign of discomfort. When she didn't pull away, he raised her fingers to his lips in a gesture of such old-fashioned courtesy that tears pricked her eyes. "Good afternoon, Your Grace. Would you do me the honor of walking with me in the gardens?" Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the scars both visible and invisible that they both carried, Evelyn found herself smiling back. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." They walked through the formal gardens in the afternoon light, talking tentatively about inconsequential things. Her favorite books, his experiences traveling on the continent before the war, their shared appreciation for music. It was not the transformative conversation that would heal all wounds, but it was a beginning. A fragile, cautious beginning that promised something neither of them had expected when they spoke their vows in St. George's Church. The possibility that from duty and distance, something genuine might grow. Winter settled over Derbyshire with particular severity that year. Snow transforming Ashford Hall's parklands into a crystalline landscape of stunning beauty. But inside the great house, a different kind of transformation was taking place, one measured not in frozen water, but in thawing hearts. Over the weeks following their garden conversation, Evelyn and Alexander had begun the delicate process of actual acquaintance. They took breakfast together in the informal dining room, discussing estate matters and household business. They read in companionable silence in the library during the long evenings, occasionally sharing passages that struck them as particularly insightful or entertaining. They walked the galleries, Alexander explaining the history behind family portraits, while Evelyn offered observations about the artistic techniques employed. Most significantly, Alexander had begun spending time in Evelyn's sitting room in the evenings, not pressing for intimacy she wasn't ready to offer, but simply sharing space, talking about their days, their thoughts, their gradually emerging hopes for what their marriage might become. The connecting door between their chambers remained closed at night, but the wall it represented was becoming increasingly transparent. Lady Augusta, who had extended her visit indefinitely with the cheerful disregard for propriety that characterized all her actions, observed their growing rapport with satisfaction. "You're good for him," she told Evelyn one afternoon as they worked on embroidery in the morning room. "I haven't seen Alexander this present, this engaged with life, since before he left for Spain." Evelyn kept her eyes on her needlework, uncomfortable with the praise. "We're still learning each other." "Which is as it should be. Marriage is not a moment, child. It's a lifetime of learning." Lady Augusta set down her embroidery hoop with the air of someone making an important pronouncement. "Speaking of which, London for the season begins in 3 months. You'll need to establish yourself in society as the Duchess of Ashford." The thought of returning to London, to the scene of her humiliating wedding breakfast, to society's judgmental gaze, made Evelyn's stomach clench with anxiety. "Perhaps we could remain at Ashford Hall." "Nonsense! You can't hide in Derbyshire forever. Besides, running from society only gives them power over you." Lady Augusta's eyes sharpened with calculation. "What you need is a reintroduction on your own terms. A demonstration that you are not some desperate girl grateful for rescue, but a duchess of substance and style." That evening, when Alexander joined her in her sitting room for their customary conversation, Evelyn mentioned Lady Augusta's suggestion. To her surprise, his reaction was immediately protective. "You don't have to return to London if you're not comfortable," he said, setting down the book he'd been reading. "Society can be viciously cruel, particularly to newcomers to elevated ranks." "I can't hide forever," Evelyn replied, echoing Lady Augusta's words. "And avoiding London would only fuel speculation about why we're remaining isolated." Alexander's expression darkened. "Let them speculate. Your comfort is more important than society's gossip." His fierce protectiveness warmed something in Evelyn's chest, even as it frightened her slightly. Over the past weeks, she had glimpsed the depth of feeling Alexander was capable of when he allowed himself to feel at all. It manifested in small gestures, ensuring her favorite tea was always available, remembering her mentioned preference for lilacs and having the conservatory cultivate them out of season, commissioning a pianoforte for her personal sitting room when she mentioned missing music. But there was also an intensity to his attention that sometimes overwhelmed her. When they were together, she felt the weight of his focus, the careful way he monitored her reactions, alert for any sign of discomfort or distress. It was as though he had appointed himself guardian of her well-being, a role he pursued with the same single-minded dedication he brought to all his responsibilities. "I think Lady Augusta is right," Evelyn said carefully. "I need to establish myself as your Duchess, to show society that I'm not ashamed of our marriage or my position." Alexander studied her face in the firelight, his dark eyes searching for something. "Is that what you want, or what you think is required?" The question was quintessentially Alexander, cutting through surface politeness to the truth underneath. It was one of the things Evelyn had come to value about him, even when it made conversations uncomfortable. "Both," she admitted. "I want to prove myself capable of this role, but I'm also aware that my failure to do so reflects on you and your family." "Oh, my family can weather any amount of social disapproval," Alexander said firmly. "We've been doing it for 3 generations, but I won't subject you to public scrutiny if it causes you distress." "Then help me prepare for it," Evelyn replied. "Work with me to create a strategy for my reintroduction that puts me in the strongest possible position." Something like pride flickered across Alexander's features. "You sound like a general planning a campaign. I learned from my circumstances that survival sometimes requires strategic thinking." Alexander rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her so their eyes were level. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to ducal dignity, that Evelyn's breath caught. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "I want you to know that. Not because you're strategic or competent, though you are both those things, but because you refuse to let what happened to you define your entire existence, because you're willing to face the thing that frightens you rather than hide from it." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm not as brave as you think. You're braver than you know." His hand reached up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the single tear that had escaped. "And I'm honored to stand beside you, whatever you choose to face." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. For the first time since their wedding night, Evelyn felt the pull of genuine attraction, not born of duty or requirement, but of growing respect and affection for the man her husband was revealing himself to be. Before either of them could act on the moment, a knock at the door shattered the intimacy. Alexander rose smoothly, his ducal composure sliding back into place like a well-worn coat, and called permission to enter. Mrs. Crawford appeared, her usually composed face showing signs of agitation. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but you have visitors. They arrived without notice and are requesting immediate audience." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Who travels in this weather without notice?" "Lord and Lady Pembroke, Your Grace, and they've brought guests. Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Ashworth." The names hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Marcus Ashworth, the man who had assaulted her, whose violence had left the scars Alexander had discovered on their wedding night, and Lord Pembroke, the officer who had made those cruel observations at their wedding breakfast about her desperate circumstances. Blood drained from her face. Alexander, watching her reaction with the attention he always paid to her well-being, went very still. "Send them away," he said, his voice cold as winter frost. "Tell them we are not receiving visitors. Your Grace, they claim to have travelled specifically to congratulate you on your marriage and to deliver important correspondence from Lord Castlereagh regarding parliamentary business." Alexander's jaw tightened. The mention of Lord Castlereagh, a powerful figure in government, made refusing the visit politically complicated. But his eyes never left Evelyn's face, reading her distress with growing fury. "Give us a moment," he told Mrs. Crawford. When the housekeeper departed, he turned to Evelyn. "Is Marcus Ashworth the man who hurt you?" There was no point in denial. Her reaction had revealed everything. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in her throat. The transformation in Alexander was terrifying. The careful, controlled man who had been courting her trust vanished, replaced by something savage and barely leashed. His hands clenched into fists, the muscles in his jaw jumping as he visibly fought for control. "I will send them away," he said, each word precisely enunciated. "You need never see him." "No." Evelyn found her voice, though it shook. "Lady Augusta is right. I can't hide forever, and sending them away without explanation would only fuel curiosity and speculation. Evelyn, I can do this." She stood, drawing on reserves of strength she had cultivated through necessity. "But I need you with me. I need to know you're there." Alexander's expression softened slightly, though the fury remained banked in his eyes. "Always, I will always be there." He offered his arm in a gesture of both courtesy and support. "But if he says one word out of place, if he looks at you in any way that causes you discomfort, I will remove him from this house physically. Diplomatic consequences be damned." They descended to the drawing room together, Evelyn's hand trembling on Alexander's arm, despite her determination to appear composed. She could feel the coiled tension in his body, the predator's readiness beneath his civilized exterior. The Pembrokes and Ashworths were arranged in the drawing room with the casual entitlement of the aristocracy, accustomed to welcome wherever they appeared. Lord Pembroke rose as they entered, his smile showing too many teeth. "Ashford, my dear fellow, forgive the intrusion, but we were passing through Derbyshire and couldn't resist the opportunity to extend our congratulations in person." Marcus Ashworth stood beside his wife, a handsome man in his 30s with the kind of polished charm that concealed cruelty. When his eyes met Evelyn's, she saw recognition flicker across his features, followed by something calculating. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over Evelyn's hand with practiced grace. "How delightful to see you again. It has been too long." His touch made her skin crawl. She withdrew her hand as quickly as courtesy permitted, feeling Alexander's arm tense beneath her fingers. "Mr. Ashworth," she managed, her voice steady through sheer force of will. Lady Ashworth, Marcus's wife, was a pretty blonde woman who seemed entirely unaware of her husband's true nature. "We were so surprised to learn of your marriage, Your Grace. Marcus tells me you once companioned his aunt. What a remarkable rise in circumstances." The subtle insult was delivered with a smile, suggesting Evelyn had leveraged her position as a paid companion to secure a duke. Before Evelyn could formulate a response, Alexander's voice cut through the room like a blade. "My wife's circumstances have always been distinguished by her family's ancient lineage and her personal character. I consider myself fortunate that she consented to accept my suit, despite having other options." It was a complete fabrication. Evelyn had no other options, but delivered with such absolute conviction that it momentarily silenced the room. Lord Pembroke recovered first, laughing uncomfortably. Of course. No offense intended. We're all friends here, eh?" "Are we?" Alexander's question was soft but deadly. "I seem to recall some rather uncharitable observations at our wedding breakfast, Pembroke. Remarks about my wife's family circumstances and my supposed reluctance to marry." Lord Pembroke's face reddened. "A jest, Ashford. Nothing more. You know how it is after a few glasses of champagne. I know that a gentleman does not insult his host's wife, intoxicated or otherwise." Alexander's tone could have frozen water. "Perhaps you should clarify for me exactly what you found amusing about public humiliation." The tension in the room ratcheted upward. Mrs. Ashworth looked confused, Lady Pembroke appeared mortified, and Marcus Ashworth's expression had shifted from calculation to wariness. Evelyn realized with sudden clarity what was happening. Alexander wasn't simply defending her honor in the abstract. He was deliberately creating a confrontation, forcing the situation to a point where it couldn't be ignored or smoothed over with polite fictions. He was claiming her, publicly and unmistakably, as someone under his protection. And he was giving her the choice of how to respond. She could diffuse the situation with gracious words, maintaining social harmony at the cost of allowing the insults to stand unchallenged. Or she could stand beside her husband, embracing the conflict and the consequences. Evelyn thought of Lady Augusta's words, "Running from society only gives them power over you." She thought of Alexander's observation, "You refuse to let what happened to you define your entire existence." She thought of the woman she had been 2 years ago, desperate, ashamed, convinced that survival meant silence and acceptance, and she decided that woman was gone. "I think, Lord Pembroke," Evelyn said, her voice clear and carrying despite the fear hammering in her chest, "that you should apologize. To both of us, your comments at our wedding were inappropriate and hurtful. If you value your friendship with my husband, you'll acknowledge that." The room fell into stunned silence. Ladies simply did not speak so directly, particularly newly elevated duchesses addressing peers of the realm. Lord Pembroke's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on puce. That is, if offense was taken, I certainly—" "The offense was given," Alexander interjected coldly. "Whether it was taken is beside the point. But my wife has shown you more grace than you deserve by offering you the opportunity to make amends. I suggest you accept it." Lord Pembroke swallowed hard, recognizing that he had miscalculated badly. The Duke of Ashford was not a man to be trifled with, and his protection of his wife was absolute. "Please accept my sincere apologies, Your Grace," he said to Evelyn, his earlier bonhomie entirely absent. "My remarks were thoughtless and inappropriate." "Accepted," Evelyn said, though the word cost her something. The visit concluded shortly thereafter, the Pembrokes and Ashworths making hasty excuses about needing to reach their destination before nightfall. As they prepared to depart, Marcus Ashworth approached Evelyn one final time, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Clever girl, securing a protector, but we both know what you really are, don't we?" Before Evelyn could respond, Alexander materialized at her side with predatory speed. "Mr. Ashworth, I believe you were leaving." There was something in Alexander's eyes, a promise of violence barely restrained, that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. "Of course. Good day, Your Grace. Your Grace." He bowed and retreated with admirable speed. When the visitors had finally departed, Alexander closed the drawing-room door and turned to Evelyn. The fury that had been leashed throughout the encounter blazed in his eyes. That was him. It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. "What did he say to you at the end?" She shook her head, not wanting to repeat Marcus's parting cruelty, but Alexander's expression told her he wouldn't accept evasion. "He suggested I was clever to secure your protection," she whispered, "and that we both know what I really am." Alexander's hands clenched into fists, his whole body vibrating with barely suppressed rage. "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to call him out, and I'm going to kill him." "You can't." Evelyn reached out to grip his arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. A duel would create a scandal. Questions would be asked about the cause. The truth would come out, or a version of it, and my reputation would be destroyed. I don't care about scandal. I care about justice. So do I, but not at the cost of everything we're building. Evelyn moved closer, placing both hands on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palms. "What I need from you isn't revenge. It's exactly what you gave me today. Your absolute unwavering support, the knowledge that I'm not alone, that I don't have to face society's judgment without someone standing beside me." Alexander's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes searching her face. "I can give you that. I will give you that, but it doesn't feel like enough." "It's everything," Evelyn whispered. And then, because the moment seemed to demand it, because something fundamental had shifted between them through the crucible of the past hour. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative, inexperienced, flavored with the salt of tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. But Alexander met her with infinite gentleness, his hands coming up to frame her face, his lips moving against hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When they finally separated, his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. "I love you," he said, the words raw and unguarded. "I didn't plan to. I didn't think I was capable of it anymore. But I love you with a ferocity that terrifies me." Evelyn felt the words settle into her heart like something precious and fragile. "I'm not sure I know how to love anymore. I'm not sure I remember how. Then we'll learn together." Alexander's smile was soft, transforming his severe features into something beautiful. "We'll learn everything together." The scandal broke 3 weeks after the Pembrokes' disastrous visit, though not in the way anyone could have anticipated. Word spread through society with the speed of wildfire. The Duke of Ashford had severed all social and business ties with Lord Pembroke and had publicly withdrawn support for his parliamentary ambitions. More shockingly, he had called upon Marcus Ashworth to demand an accounting for ungentlemanly conduct toward a lady under ducal protection, stopping just short of an actual challenge, but making his contempt abundantly clear. The gossip mills churned with speculation. What had Pembroke and Ashworth done to earn the Iron Duke's legendary wrath? The most popular theory suggested financial malfeasance or political betrayal. A smaller faction whispered about inappropriate attention paid to the new Duchess, though details remained frustratingly vague. What no one in society could have guessed was that Alexander's calculated actions were not impulsive revenge, but strategic warfare. Working with Lady Augusta, who possessed decades of experience navigating society's treacherous currents, he had crafted a campaign designed to accomplish multiple objectives: punish the men who had wronged his wife without revealing the specific nature of their offenses, establish Evelyn's position as someone under his absolute protection, and demonstrate to anyone contemplating disrespect that the consequences would be severe and permanent. "Reputation is currency in our world," Lady Augusta explained to Evelyn as they reviewed invitations in the morning room. "Alexander has just spent a considerable amount of his political capital to defend yours. Society will take note. More importantly, they'll adjust their behavior accordingly." The results were immediately apparent. Invitations began arriving at Ashford Hall with increasing frequency, every hostess in London suddenly desperate to secure the Duke and Duchess of Ashford's presence at their events. The motivation was partly curiosity, partly political calculation, but the effect was undeniable. Evelyn was no longer dismissed as a desperate nobody, but regarded as someone worthy of cultivation. "Your position is secure," Lady Augusta continued, "but you'll need to be strategic about your re-entry into society. The right event, the right moment, the right presentation." That opportunity came in the form of an invitation to Lady Palmerston's legendary Winter Ball, the most prestigious event of the season outside of Almack's itself. Acceptance would mean travelling to London, facing society en masse for the first time since the humiliating wedding breakfast, and navigating social dynamics while under intense scrutiny. "I think we should accept," Evelyn said, meeting Alexander's concerned gaze across the breakfast table. They had grown increasingly comfortable with each other over the intervening weeks. Alexander now took breakfast in Evelyn's sitting room most mornings, their conversation ranging from estate business to philosophy to shared observations about the often absurd nature of aristocratic life. He still respected the boundary of her bedchamber, never entering without invitation, but the emotional intimacy between them had deepened significantly. "Are you certain?" Alexander set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. "I won't force you to face society before you're ready." "I'm not sure I'll ever feel ready," Evelyn admitted. "But hiding in Derbyshire indefinitely isn't a viable strategy. We've built the foundation for my reintroduction. Your public defense of my honor, Lady Augusta's strategic gossip campaign, the social backing of your family name. Now we need to follow through." Alexander studied her face with the careful attention he always paid to her well-being. "Then we'll go to London, but on one condition: the moment you feel uncomfortable, the instant you want to leave, we depart. I don't care about political consequences or social obligations. Your comfort takes precedence over everything." His protectiveness, which might have felt suffocating from another man, somehow felt liberating from Alexander. He offered it not as restriction, but as security, creating a safe space within which she could take risks. "Agreed," Evelyn said, reaching across the table to take his hand. The gesture had become natural over recent weeks, this casual physical affection that suggested growing intimacy without demanding more than she was ready to give. The journey to London took 3 days, travelling with full ducal retinue to Ashford House in Mayfair. The mansion was even more impressive than Evelyn remembered from her wedding breakfast, its proportions speaking to generations of accumulated wealth and power. The staff greeted them with formal ceremony, clearly pleased to have the Duke and his Duchess in residence. Lady Augusta, who had travelled ahead to prepare the way, was waiting in the drawing room with barely contained excitement. "Everything is arranged. Your new wardrobe is ready for final fittings. I've accepted select invitations on your behalf, and I've strategically let it be known that you're receiving callers on Tuesday afternoon." Over the following days, Evelyn was transformed through the alchemy of fashion and professional expertise. Madame Dubois, London's premier modiste, created a wardrobe that balanced current style with timeless elegance. The gowns were cut to flatter Evelyn's figure while maintaining the modesty she required. High necklines and clever draping ensuring her scars remained hidden while still adhering to fashionable silhouettes. For the Palmerston Ball, Madame Dubois had created a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in Evelyn's eyes and complemented her auburn hair. The Ashford sapphires, a legendary parure that included necklace, earrings, bracelet and tiara, completed the ensemble, their weight both literal and symbolic. "You look like a duchess," Lady Augusta said approvingly as Evelyn examined her reflection the night of the ball. "More importantly, you look like someone secure in her position and indifferent to criticism." "Even though I'm neither secure nor indifferent?" "Especially because you're neither. Confidence is a performance, child. Eventually, if you perform it long enough, it becomes reality." Alexander's reaction when he saw her was everything Evelyn could have hoped for. He stopped mid-sentence in his conversation with his secretary, his dark eyes widening as he took in her appearance. "You're breathtaking," he said simply, dismissing the secretary with a gesture. When they were alone, he crossed to where she stood, taking both her hands in his. "I'm the most fortunate man in England." "Or the most strategic," Evelyn replied with a small smile. "You chose well when you needed a duchess." "I chose better than I deserved," Alexander corrected, "and I'm reminded of that fact every single day." The Palmerston Ball was exactly as magnificent and intimidating as anticipated. The ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles, reflecting off crystal chandeliers and gilt moulding. The cream of society was in attendance, titled families, political powers, wealthy merchants elevated to gentility. Everyone was there to see and be seen, to form alliances and identify enemies, to navigate the treacherous currents of aristocratic politics. When the Duke and Duchess of Ashford were announced, conversation in the ballroom briefly stuttered. Evelyn felt hundreds of eyes assess her appearance, her demeanour, her worthiness to stand beside one of England's most powerful dukes. Alexander's hand at the small of her back was steady, his presence beside her a bulwark against judgment. Together, they descended the stairs into the ballroom, and society's verdict was rendered through the immediate cluster of people approaching to pay respects. Lady Palmerston herself greeted them with effusive warmth. "Your Graces, what an honour. Duchess, you are absolutely radiant. That colour is extraordinary on you." Other guests quickly followed, a calculated stream of compliments and curiosity. Evelyn responded with the poise she had cultivated through necessity, her answers polite but unrevealing, her smile practiced but seemingly genuine. Beside her, Alexander radiated the cold authority that characterized his public persona, his protection of her both subtle and unmistakable. They were engaged in conversation with the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire when Charlotte appeared at the edge of the crowd. Evelyn's sister had come to London for the season, under the chaperonage of a distant cousin, her expenses quietly funded by Alexander's generosity, though Charlotte didn't know the source. "Evelyn!" Charlotte's embrace was genuine, though Evelyn sensed some tension beneath her sister's cheerful demeanor. "You look absolutely magnificent. Everyone is talking about you." "Hopefully favorably," Evelyn replied. Charlotte's expression flickered with something Evelyn couldn't quite interpret. "Of course, though," she glanced at Alexander, then back to Evelyn. "Might I speak with you privately, just for a moment?" Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded permission. Evelyn allowed Charlotte to draw her aside to a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom, anxiety coiling in her stomach. "What's wrong?" Evelyn asked. Charlotte bit her lip, looking younger than her 19 years. "I need to tell you something. About Marcus Ashworth." Every muscle in Evelyn's body tensed. "What about him?" "He's been telling stories. Nothing explicit, but insinuations, suggestions that you had a relationship with him before your marriage, that you were not as innocent as you pretended." Charlotte's face flushed with embarrassment. "I've been trying to contradict the rumors, but he's very persuasive, and he's suggested that if you try to deny his claims, he has evidence that would be damaging." Rage and terror warred in Evelyn's chest. Marcus was attempting to destroy her reputation proactively, creating a narrative that would frame any accusation she might make as the revenge of a scorned woman. It was clever, vicious, and devastatingly effective. "There's more," Charlotte continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He suggested to several people that your marriage to the Duke was motivated by desperation to hide a pregnancy, that the Duke only married you because you trapped him somehow. The accusations were absurd but dangerous precisely because they played into existing prejudices about her family's financial situation. Society would be all too willing to believe that a desperate girl from a failing family had used sexual manipulation to secure a duke." "Charlotte," Evelyn said carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Nothing Marcus Ashworth has said is true, but I need you to trust me when I tell you that addressing his lies directly would only make things worse." Charlotte's eyes widened. "So, you're just going to let him destroy your reputation?" "No," said a cold voice behind them. Alexander had materialized without either of them noticing, his expression carved from ice. "She's going to let me handle it." "Your Grace," Charlotte said, dropping into a curtsy. "Miss Lancaster." Alexander's tone was marginally warmer when addressing Evelyn's sister. "I appreciate your loyalty to your sister, but this situation requires a more strategic response than direct confrontation." He turned his attention to Evelyn, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice. Alexander's hand found hers, squeezing gently, a gesture of support hidden from the surrounding crowd by their positioning. "Dance with me," he said, not a request, but a command softened by affection. He led her onto the ballroom floor as a waltz began, one arm circling her waist, the other taking her hand in a hold that was both technically correct and unmistakably possessive. They moved together with practiced grace, the dancing lessons they'd undertaken at Lady Augusta's insistence paying dividends. "Ashworth is attempting to preemptively destroy your credibility," Alexander said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "It's actually a tactical error. It suggests he fears what you might reveal." "How is that useful when society believes his lies?" "Because his desperation to control the narrative reveals that there is a narrative to control. It gives us leverage." Alexander's hand tightened on her waist. "Do you trust me to handle this?" Evelyn met his dark eyes, seeing the barely leashed fury burning there alongside something softer. Devotion, perhaps, or that ferocious love he had confessed to in the drawing room at Ashford Hall. "I trust you," she said, and meant it completely. "Then follow my lead." As the waltz concluded, Alexander guided her not back to the edges of the ballroom, but to its centre, where Lady Palmerston was holding court. The crowd parted before them with the automatic deference accorded to a duke, though Evelyn could feel the weight of curious and judgmental eyes tracking their progress. "Lady Palmerston," Alexander said, his voice carrying with the projection of someone accustomed to addressing Parliament, "I must beg your indulgence for a moment." The ballroom quieted, sensing something significant was about to occur. Lady Palmerston, always alert to drama that would make her ball memorable, gestured encouragingly. Alexander turned to face the assembled guests, Evelyn's hand firmly clasped in his. "I am aware that certain rumours have been circulating regarding my wife and the circumstances of our marriage. I will address them once, publicly, and then consider the matter permanently closed." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Hundreds of aristocrats held their collective breath. "I pursued my wife's hand in marriage after observing her character, intelligence and grace in managing impossible circumstances. I am privileged beyond measure that she accepted my suit despite having every reason to reject it." Alexander's voice hardened. "Any suggestion that she trapped me, manipulated me, or behaved in any manner contrary to the highest standards of virtue is not only false, but personally insulting. I chose her. She elevated me through her acceptance, not the reverse." He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. "Furthermore, I am aware that Marcus Ashworth has been spreading malicious falsehoods about my wife. I say now, publicly and unequivocally, that Ashworth is a liar. His motivations for attempting to destroy her reputation are his own to explain, though I suspect they stem from a guilty conscience and fear of consequences for past actions." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. To call another gentleman a liar in public was tantamount to challenging him to a duel. "I will not elaborate further on Ashworth's transgressions," Alexander continued, "as doing so would require me to discuss matters too distressing for general conversation. But I swear on my family's honor that if he continues to spread lies about my wife, I will reveal every detail of his ungentlemanly conduct. Consequences be damned." It was a masterful performance, defending Evelyn's honor absolutely, while hinting at justification serious enough to warrant his protection without revealing details that would harm her reputation. Society would fill in the gaps with speculation, but the Duke's conviction would carry more weight than Ashworth's insinuations. Alexander turned back to Lady Palmerston. "I apologize for disrupting your magnificent ball with such unpleasant business. But I would not have my wife's name dishonored without response." Lady Palmerston's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "This ball would be discussed for years. Your Grace, a man's first duty is to his wife's honor. You have discharged that duty admirably." As Alexander led Evelyn away from the center of the ballroom, guests parted before them with expressions ranging from admiration to calculation. The Duchess of Bedford, one of society's most influential matrons, stopped them with a raised hand. "Your Grace," she said to Evelyn, "I would be honored if you would call upon me next week. I believe we have much to discuss regarding your charitable interests and your position as Duchess of Ashford." It was an explicit offering of social backing from one of the most powerful women in England. Evelyn accepted with appropriate gratitude, understanding the significance of the gesture. Other invitations followed throughout the evening, to intimate dinners, afternoon salons, exclusive literary discussions. Each represented an endorsement of Evelyn's social position, a declaration that she was not merely tolerated, but welcomed into society's upper echelons. When they finally returned to Ashford House in the early morning hours, Evelyn felt exhausted but exhilarated. Alexander accompanied her to her chambers, his hand warm and steady on her back. "You were magnificent tonight," he said when they reached her door. "Every inch a duchess." "I was terrified the entire time." "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." Alexander's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "I meant every word I said tonight. You did not trap me. You freed me." Evelyn leaned into his touch, feeling the last of her emotional walls crumbling. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. I'm not ready for everything. But I don't want to be alone." Alexander's eyes darkened with emotion. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain I trust you, and I'm certain I want you close." He followed her into the chamber, helping her remove the Ashford sapphires and set them carefully in their cases. They lay together on top of the coverlet, still fully clothed, Alexander's arms creating a protective circle around her. Evelyn pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling safe in a way she hadn't experienced since before Marcus Ashworth shattered her innocence. "I love you," she said into the silence. "I wasn't sure I could feel that for anyone anymore, but I love you." Alexander's arms tightened around her. "We're going to build something extraordinary together, a marriage based not on convenience or necessity, but on genuine partnership, on choosing each other every single day." "I choose you," Evelyn whispered. "And I choose you," Alexander replied. "Always." 6 months after the Palmerston Ball, Evelyn stood in the music room at Ashford Hall, sunlight streaming through the tall windows as her fingers moved across the pianoforte keys. The piece was Beethoven, technically challenging, emotionally complex, requiring complete focus to execute properly. It was exactly the kind of music she had once thought she'd never have time or peace enough to master. Outside, Derbyshire displayed itself in full spring glory. The gardens that had been bare and brown during her first winter as Duchess now exploded with colour. Daffodils and tulips in the formal beds, cherry trees in blossom along the paths, new green clothing every branch and vine. It was as though the estate itself had been waiting through winter dormancy for the right moment to bloom. She reached the final crescendo and let the last notes fade into silence before becoming aware of applause from the doorway. Alexander leaned against the frame, his cravat loosened and his expression soft in the way it only ever was when they were private. "Beautiful," he said. "The music, I mean. Though the musician deserves equal praise." Evelyn smiled, rising from the instrument. "You're home early. I missed you." He crossed the room to pull her into his arms, a gesture that had become natural over the months of their marriage. "And I have news. Good news or complicated news? Both, possibly." Alexander's expression turned serious. "Marcus Ashworth has left England. Apparently, he had accumulated substantial gambling debts that could no longer be ignored, and several creditors were threatening legal action. He's fled to the continent, effectively exiling himself from society." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite relief, not exactly satisfaction, but a sense of closure. "And Lady Ashworth has filed for separation, citing abandonment and cruelty. Lady Augusta says she's been quietly sharing stories with select friends about his behavior during their marriage. Nothing explicit, but enough to ensure he'll never be welcomed back to society, even if he returns." "I'm sorry for her," Evelyn said quietly. She seemed genuinely unaware of his true nature. "As you were when it mattered." Alexander's hand came up to cup her cheek in the tender gesture that had become his trademark expression of affection. "His departure doesn't undo what he did to you, but perhaps knowing he faces consequences, even if they're not the ones I would have preferred to deliver personally, offers some peace." Evelyn leaned into his touch, considering the question. 6 months ago, she would have said that peace was impossible while her attacker walked free and unpunished. But the months since had taught her that healing was not contingent on revenge or justice in the traditional sense. It came from building something new, from choosing growth over bitterness, from allowing herself to be loved without condition. "I have peace," she said, meeting his dark eyes, "because I have you." Alexander's expression transformed with that smile that still made her breath catch, the one that softened his severe features into something beautiful. "And I have you, which makes me the most fortunate man in England." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel interrupted the moment. Through the window, Evelyn spotted a familiar vehicle bearing her family's crest. Her mother had recovered sufficiently to travel, thanks to the excellent physicians and treatments Alexander's resources had secured, and was making her first visit to Ashford Hall with Charlotte. "They're here," Evelyn said, excitement colouring her voice. Despite everything, she loved her family and wanted desperately for them to see her happiness, to understand that her marriage had become something far more than the business arrangement it had begun as. The reunion in the entrance hall was joyful and emotional. Lady Lancaster, still somewhat fragile but infinitely better than she had been, embraced her daughter with tears streaming down her face. "You look radiant," she whispered, "truly happy. I was so worried that we had forced you into a loveless marriage for our sake." "You didn't force me into anything," Evelyn replied, meaning it, "and the marriage is far from loveless." Charlotte, meanwhile, was examining the magnificent estate with wide eyes. Her first season in London had been successful. She had received multiple offers of marriage from respectable gentlemen, a triumph made possible by the social rehabilitation of the Lancaster name through Evelyn's position. She had accepted none of them yet, displaying a romantic streak that Evelyn found both endearing and slightly concerning. "You really are a duchess," Charlotte said, awe in her voice. "I knew it intellectually. But seeing you here in this place, mistress of all this, it's extraordinary, Evelyn." Over the following days, Evelyn showed her family the full scope of her new life, the estate's farms and tenant cottages, which she now managed with the help of Alexander's excellent steward. The charitable foundation she had established to support families in circumstances similar to the Lancasters' situation, genteel poverty combined with medical crisis. The scholarship program she had created for young women seeking education and independence. But more than the material evidence of her position, she showed them the partnership she had built with Alexander, the way they consulted on estate decisions, respecting each other's perspectives, the private jokes and shared glances that spoke to genuine affection, the small gestures of consideration that characterized their daily interactions. On the final evening of the visit, Lady Lancaster asked to speak with Evelyn privately. They sat in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and the evening songs of birds settling for the night. "I want to apologize," her mother said, taking Evelyn's hands in her thin ones. "Your father and I were so desperate to secure your future and manage our debts that we didn't truly consider what we were asking of you. We pushed you toward a marriage with a stranger, prioritizing financial security over your happiness or well-being." "Mama!" "Let me finish." Lady Lancaster's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I have spent months tormented by guilt, wondering if we had essentially sold you to save ourselves. But seeing you here, seeing how you and the Duke look at each other, I realize that while the beginning may have been born of necessity, what you've built transcends those origins." "It does," Evelyn agreed softly. "I won't pretend the early weeks were easy, or that I didn't resent the circumstances that forced me into marriage. But Alexander and I chose to make our arrangement into something real. We chose each other eventually, even though the initial choice was made for us." "You've done more than survive," her mother observed. "You've flourished, and in doing so, you've given Charlotte and me the opportunity to flourish as well." It was true. Charlotte's successful season, their mother's restored health, their father's renewed confidence, now that the debts were cleared, all of it stemmed from Evelyn's sacrifice that had somehow transformed into triumph. After her family departed, life at Ashford Hall settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly like home. Evelyn's reputation in society was secure, her position as Duchess acknowledged not just by title, but by the respect with which she was treated. She was consulted on charitable initiatives, invited to serve as patroness for artistic endeavors, acknowledged as someone whose opinion carried weight. But the most significant transformation was the one happening within the private spaces of her marriage. The emotional intimacy she and Alexander had built over months of careful trust-building had gradually extended to physical intimacy as well. The first time, she had invited him to stay in her bed for more than comfort. The first time, she had let him see all her scars and love them as part of her story, rather than evidence of damage. Those moments had been terrifying and healing in equal measure. Alexander's patience had been infinite, his gentleness absolute. He never demanded more than she was ready to give, never made her feel that her pace of healing was inadequate. And gradually, she had learned that physical intimacy with someone who truly loved her was nothing like the violence she had experienced. It was communication and connection, vulnerability and trust, pleasure offered and received as gifts rather than taken as entitlements. One morning in early summer, as they lay tangled together in the early dawn light, Alexander's hand tracing idle patterns on her shoulder, Evelyn felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened her. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, his voice rough with sleep. "That I'm happy," Evelyn replied. "Genuinely, completely happy, and I'm not entirely certain what to do with that feeling." Alexander shifted to prop himself on one elbow, looking down at her with eyes soft with love. "You could start by accepting that you deserve it. That happiness is not a finite resource that must be rationed, or a reward that must be earned through suffering. When did you become so wise?" "When I fell in love with a woman who taught me that surviving trauma doesn't mean being defined by it. That growth is possible even after the worst has happened. That love, real, transformative love, can heal wounds we thought were permanent." Evelyn reached up to trace the lines of his face, memorizing features that had become as familiar as her own. "I used to think I was trapped," she said quietly. "First by my family's circumstances, then by my assault, then by our marriage contract. But I've learned that freedom isn't the absence of obligation or connection. It's the ability to choose your response to circumstances, to decide who you want to become, regardless of what's happened to you. And who do you want to become?" "Exactly who I am right now. Your wife, not because I was forced into it, but because I choose it every single day. A duchess who uses her position to help others, rather than simply displaying it. A woman who survived something terrible and refused to let it be the end of her story." Alexander's kiss was tender, speaking volumes without words. When he finally pulled back, his expression was serious. "I have something to ask you," he said. "We've never truly discussed. That is, the question of children has not been addressed between us, given the circumstances under which we began. But if you're amenable, I would very much like to have a family with you, not because I need an heir, but because I cannot imagine anything more extraordinary than creating life with the woman I love." Evelyn's breath caught. She had avoided thinking about children, uncertain whether she could bear the vulnerability pregnancy would require, whether she could trust her body after it had been so violently violated. But looking at Alexander's hopeful, slightly anxious expression, she realized that she wanted that future with him, wanted to create something entirely new, untouched by past trauma, born of love rather than violence. "I would like that," she whispered. "I'm frightened, but I would like that very much." "We'll face the fear together," Alexander promised, "as we face everything, together." El deal. The announcement of Evelyn's pregnancy came 6 months later, greeted with joy by family and celebration by the estate's tenants. Lady Augusta claimed to be unsurprised, having predicted it with her usual confidence. Charlotte, now engaged to a promising young baron with a genuine regard for her, was excited about becoming an aunt. The pregnancy was difficult at times, morning sickness that lasted well beyond the first trimester, anxiety that required Alexander's constant reassurance, moments of panic when Evelyn feared her body would betray her again. But through it all, Alexander remained steady. He read to her when she couldn't sleep, held her hand through the worst of the sickness, consulted physicians, and engaged a midwife known for her gentle care. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, her first cries echoing through Ashford Hall with such force that the entire household celebrated. She was perfect, impossibly tiny, with Alexander's dark hair and what might develop into Evelyn's blue eyes. They named her Augusta Eleanor, honoring both the aunt who had championed their unconventional beginning and Evelyn's mother. As Evelyn held her daughter for the first time, Alexander sitting beside the bed with his hand covering both of hers, she was struck by the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment. She had begun as a desperate girl, accepting a marriage of convenience. She had survived assault and shame and society's judgment. She had built a partnership with a man she hadn't chosen but had learned to love completely. And now she held in her arms the physical embodiment of that transformation, a child born not of necessity but of choice, of love, of the deliberate decision to create beauty from brokenness. "She's perfect," Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're perfect. I don't have words for what I'm feeling." "Neither do I," Evelyn admitted. "But I think it might be joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy." Alexander's kiss landed on her forehead, gentle and reverent. "You've given me everything. A life I thought I'd lost the capacity for. Love I thought I didn't deserve. Now a daughter who will grow up knowing what genuine partnership looks like." "We gave those things to each other," Evelyn corrected. "This wasn't something you did for me or I did for you. This was something we built together, from the worst possible beginning into something extraordinary." Outside the bedroom windows, Ashford Hall's gardens displayed themselves in full spring bloom. Inside, a family that had been assembled through duty had transformed itself through choice, through persistence, through the radical act of refusing to let circumstances dictate their happiness. Evelyn looked down at her daughter's sleeping face and felt the weight of the past finally fully release its hold on her heart. She was no longer the desperate girl accepting a duke's proposal to save her family. She was no longer the victim of assault carrying shame that didn't belong to her. She was no longer performing the role of Duchess while feeling like an imposter. She was Evelyn Grayson, Duchess of Ashford, wife to a man she loved profoundly, mother to a daughter who would never know what it meant to have her choices stolen, a woman who had survived everything designed to break her and emerged stronger, softer, more fully herself than she had ever been allowed to be before. The scars on her shoulder remained. They would always remain. Physical testaments to trauma survived. But they no longer defined her story. They were simply part of it, chapters that had led to this moment of perfect contentment, this family built from ashes, this love that had been chosen rather than mandated. "I love you," she said to Alexander, to Augusta, sleeping in her arms, to the life they had created together through determination and patience, and the refusal to settle for less than everything. "I love you," Alexander replied. "Today, tomorrow, always." And in that moment, surrounded by love and possibility, Evelyn understood that healing was not a destination, but a journey. That forgiveness of herself, of circumstances, of the past, was possible. That from the worst beginnings, the most beautiful futures could grow. She had bloomed exactly where she was planted, transforming cold, contractual soil into fertile ground for genuine love. And in doing so, she had created a legacy that would extend far beyond herself, a testament to the extraordinary power of choosing hope over bitterness, love over fear, growth over stagnation. The Duke had treated their wedding night as ceasefire, a temporary pause in his emotional warfare against feeling, but the glimpse of her scars had shattered his defenses entirely, transforming what should have been a cold business arrangement into something fierce and real and utterly transformative. They had both been broken when they met. Together they had learned to be whole. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're hearing this story. I want to know how far it has traveled.